case study, the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. Lots of interest to that in these genealogies in antiquity and down to today. You know them, the one that traces from Adam down to Noah through Seth, the other one that traces from Noah's son Shem down to Abraham and his brothers. Right? So we have these two genealogies. Once we know the tendencies of these texts, now we can look at the different numbers that these texts have. Because and I'll put a chart up here in a minute that'll make your head spin about the different numbers. Because, so-and-so was so old, he, had so-and-so, and after that he lived so many years, and then the total number of years. In Genesis 11, they don't give you all three numbers. They only give you the first and third. But you know those. And there's been lots of interest in those from antiquity onwards, okay? They present several difficulties for interpreting the genealogies. The first thing you got to do is determine what's the best text, because you've got three different sets of numbers. Okay, here they are. So in the Genesis 5 genealogy, in the age when somebody generated a descendant, okay, in some cases, like here, it was 130 for Adam. Samaritan Pentateuch is 130 Septuagint, and it has 230. And then how long after that did Adam live? 800. Wait a minute, 700. The age of death? Well, they all agree 930. Something's going on there. The numbers look related. What's going on with 230 versus 130? This is 100 more, this is 100 less, which gives the same total, right? Which is kind of the pattern you get in many of these numbers. Okay, and these are all the people. And you can see the numbers all look fairly related to one another until you get up here. The number in the Masoretic text doesn't look anything like these two numbers, which appear to be related to each other. So something's going on. Okay. Now, people want to use these genealogies for all kinds of calculations. Well, what do you calculate? And I've seen people on the internet, well, we like the Septuagint better, we'll just use the Septuagint. Well, how do you know it's correct? Maybe it is in some places and not in others. And how can we determine? You can't just choose the one that suits your fancy, which unfortunately a lot of amateurs out on the internet do. I always warn my students, any fool can post anything they want on the internet, and most fools do. Okay, so there you go. Very interesting set of numbers, and that's dizzying in your head, but I'm going to try to make some sense of it for you, is how we can determine what really is going on. So here's the general pattern. Year X, that is the year until they generate a descendant, in the Masoretic text equals the year in the Septuagint, but they add 100 years to it to get the year in the Septuagint. The Samaritan Pentateuch and Masoretic text agree. The year in the Masoretic text Y, years they lived afterwards, is the same in Samaritan Pentateuch and Masoretic text, but they subtract 100 years. This is a general pattern. There are a couple exceptions, but the general pattern throughout that. And the total year of life is equal in all three. In general, there's exceptions. Okay. So it looks like there's some intentional tampering going on here with the text. What's going on? Now remember, it's the Septuagint that tends more than the other two to do intentional tampering with the text. Keep that in mind. That's why we had to go through all that other stuff. You got to keep the tendencies in mind. Okay, so Septuagint, to lesser degree, Samaritan Pentateuch tend to harmonize language and eliminate logical difficulties. Something like that going on here. The Masoretic text occasionally exhibits unintentional copy errors and a smaller and less systematically implemented intentional changes. So you can't rule out the possibility that Masoretic text might have an intentional change, but they're smaller and less intentional. You'll notice the Septuagint in those numbers seem to do it pretty systematically. Okay, that's the difference. So the X years, the years they lived before they generated a descendant, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, and Enoch appear to be much lower than the other 6 men listed. So to overcome this strange anomaly, Septuagint corrects the Hebrew text and add 100 years. Make it more uniform. And they subtract 100 years from the next one to keep the total the same. Okay? However, this would make the X years for Adam and Seth smaller than any of their descendants, and we don't want to short, especially Adam. So to preserve their preeminence, their X and Y years were also modified. Okay? We can't short the important guys, right? Methuselah's age in the Septuagint. If one assumes that the genealogies are continuous, that they skip no generations, and Methuselah's age in the Septuagint has him surviving the flood. Yeah, now that's a big if. If you can add these ages up, okay, then Methuselah survives the flood. That may mean that the person behind the Septuagint text didn't assume you could add those ages up. Either that or he was really bad at arithmetic. I don't know which.
Or Methuselah was quite a swimmer.
Yes, that's it. Him and Johnny Weissmuller, right? Therefore, it's unlikely that the person behind the Septuagint version was reading these as continuous. I think here's a case where somebody wasn't reading these as continuous genealogies. Now, we know genealogies in the Bible sometimes skip generations. If you've read Matthew 1, you know this, right? 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. And what goes on there? To get 14 generations, he leaves out some people that we know existed from the Old Testament. But he wants you to be able to memorize it. And a good way to memorize it is 14, 14, 14. Just saying. If you got the longest, anybody know the longest genealogy? What single person has the longest genealogy in the Old Testament? Might surprise you. It's Ezra. You go to the book of Ezra and gives you Ezra's genealogy. He's from a distinguished line of high priests. Now, Ezra is himself not a high priest, but he's from a distinguished line of high priests. And if you look at his genealogies that's given there, it actually skips some high priests that are mentioned earlier in the Old Testament. When we do genealogy, we don't skip generations, right? I've done a lot of genealogy. I've got this huge genealogy, and I can trace myself back to a bunch of German peasants, okay? Okay. And we don't skip. That's not necessarily what they're doing. Now, I'll tell you the one place they never skipped generations. When they did priestly genealogies, why wouldn't they skip a generation, even one, when you're doing a priestly genealogy?
Well, Germans are known to skip names if they committed suicide.
Yeah. But why wouldn't they skip it if it was a priestly?
You had to be descended from Aaron?
You had to prove that you were descended from Aaron. So you had to be complete. Okay, so and you can compare genealogies over the same period of time in the Bible in the Levitical genealogies versus non-Levitical genealogies, and you'll see there's much more generations over the same span of time. I'll talk about this later, than in the non-Levitical ones. Non-Levitical ones will skip generations. So at any rate, this guy probably thought, there was some generations skipped or something like that. So that's why he wasn't worried about Methuselah, having to have a lifesaver to hold on to or something like that.
How likely do you think it is that there are generations skipped in Genesis 5?
100% likely. We'll get into that. I know some of you are now ready to run me out of town, but I'll tell you why later on. I've got that coming up.
You disagree with Luther on his calculation of the age of Luther?
Absolutely. Luther was a great guy, but he wasn't always right.
He didn't come from Missouri, did he?
No. Well, not today. We probably won't get into it till tomorrow, but I'll give you a number of reasons why I think Genesis 5 and 11 have to skip generations and why it's grammatically possible too. Okay. Okay, differing numbers for Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech in the Samaritan Pentateuch can be explained by assuming that a scribe did think that they were a list of father's sons with no generations skipped. And so they did it to make sure that Methuselah died before the flood was done, So the Samaritan Pentateuch seems to take the opposite thing that the Septuagint does and tries to do it that way. So what you see going on in antiquity, you had people on both sides who thought some of these skipped generations and some who didn't. It's not new here. It's going on in antiquity. Okay, Samaritan Pentateuch. The lower X years, remember that's the first year until they generated a descendant. Show us that. Jared's X years were reduced by 100 in comparison to Masoretic text to yield 62 instead of 162. Okay, and to make him die in the flood instead of after it, Jared's Y and Z numbers, the years he lived afterwards of generating a descendant in his total years, were adjusted to 785 and 847 respectively to place his death in the year of the flood. Because otherwise it wouldn't, because they adjusted other things. So again, you can see what they're doing here. And that's why those numbers look so different from the numbers in the other two traditions, in the case of Jared. Okay, Methuselah's years were reduced by 100 in comparison to Septuagint, but by 120 in comparison to the Masoretic text. And I think this argues that the Septuagint's X number for Methuselah 167 is more original than Masoretic's 187. I think 187 is a copy error. That explains the 20-year difference, because the implication from Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch is that it should be 167. Lamech's numbers now needed to be adjusted, so he didn't die in the year after the flood. So Samaritan Pentateuch takes his X years to 63 to place him in line with the X numbers for these guys from Kenan through Methuselah. And then his Y was adjusted to 600 to preserve his total years to 653, exactly 100 years less than Lamech's lifespan. We're going to adjust the numbers again to get them to work. And you make these alterations and he dies in the year of the flood. So instead of having one guy die in the year of the flood, as it appears from Masoretic text, now you got three guys. Okay. Samaritan Pentateuch also solves another perceived problem. The otherwise unremarkable Methuselah lives to be older than Adam or Noah, right? People often use this trivia quiz. What's the oldest man in the Bible? Methuselah. Well, not in the Samaritan Pentateuch. He died at 720 years old, and the more prominent guys, Adam and Noah, lived to be 930 and 950. Solve that problem. Okay? Now, Masoretic numbers from Methuselah appears to be mistaken. Again, I think 187 compared to 167 in Samaritan Pentateuch and 67 Septuagint. Remember, they tend to be 100 apart, and this is 120. I think probably 167 is the correct number. And then whoever saw that 187 was put in the text, instead of adjusting it back to 167, he adjusted the next number down 20 years to get back to the total. Made the wrong correction. He was trying to correct it all. Somebody made a mistake. I'll correct their arithmetic, but he corrected it by correcting the wrong number. I think that's what's going on with Methuselah, which means he didn't die in the year of the flood. After all, he died 20 years before the flood happened, if you can add those up. Okay. The Masoretic text numbers for Lamech seem to be a problem. Z, the total years, is 653 in Samaritan Pentateuch, 753 in Septuagint, arguing that 753 in Septuagint is correct, and Masoretic texts 777 is secondary. There's usually 100 years difference between these two, and usually Samaritan Pentateuch agrees with Masoretic text. What's going on here? Lamech is also a person in the genealogy of Cain's descendants. There's a guy named Lamech there too, different Lamech. He's the seventh generation from Adam through Cain. With this genealogy of Cain's descendants, Lamech is number 7. Particularly well known because he's a braggart. Cain was associated with 7. You'll remember Cain's worried about somebody coming across him and killing him. So God puts a mark on Cain and says, I'll take 7-fold vengeance on anybody who kills Cain. Right? So 7's already associated with Cain. Lamech brags to his wife that he killed a man, and he says, if Cain was avenged 7 times, I'll be avenged 77 times. Right? Now you've got a Lamech here in the godly line of Seth. So we got to make him more noble than the murderous Lamech. So we'll adjust his numbers to 777. And this is a case where I think the Masoretic text has an intentional change. Okay. Now you're going to agree or disagree with me, but I think I'm on pretty good grounds here. You can see that these numbers, clearly there were intentional changes in these 3 traditions. Not much in Masoretic text. I think there's one accident, as I explained earlier, in Masoretic text with 160 versus 180 some years. And then this one here, which I think is intentional, 777. Okay. Does it make a difference to our salvation? Not one whit. Okay. But if you're going to start talking to me about the age of the earth, let's at least figure out what the best numbers are before we even get into the discussion. Because you've got 3 traditions. Okay. If you want to know where all this research is published, there it is. Again, it's on my academia website. I published this just a couple years ago. As a result of comparing all these variants. I just got so tired, and scholars do this all the time. Amateurs are worse at it, but scholars are pretty bad, where they will compare, in the Old Testament, they will compare textual traditions, and they'll just choose the one that suits them to make their argument, without understanding the underlying trends and the 3 traditions. So I think you need to know what's going on in the 3 traditions before you start making determinations on individual texts. You have to look at the global picture before you start looking at individual things, because otherwise you'll miss. You'll think, well, this makes perfect sense to me. Well, yeah, it makes perfect sense because they changed it to make it make perfect sense, right? Something like that. And this goes on all the time. And unfortunately, you have to do a deep dive into the text to do this. There's no other way to do it. And I literally looked at every variant I could find. And again, if you want the list of variants, if you want to see what it is, it's on my academia website, a PDF printout of my entire spreadsheet is there. You can see every one. It's why God gave us computers, so we could do stuff like that. Now, I don't know how you would do this before the age of computerized text.
So with all of these numbers, have you determined what your theory is on the age of the earth?
I can only guess. Well, we'll go into, Well, we're kind of done. Maybe we go. I don't mind working ahead because we make it bogged down. And even if we get ahead and you want to do something else, I got stuff outside of Genesis I can talk about. You'll get your money's worth one way or the other. Okay. But yeah, the next thing I will talk about is, why I don't think you can add these numbers up. That said, and I've had lots of conversations, both in person and online, with evangelicals who get real nervous at this point. If there's gaps in there, we don't know how old the earth is. All of a sudden, you can put millions of billions of years in. Well, from what I said about Genesis 1, I don't think there's millions and billions of years here. I don't think that's a reasonable reading of Genesis under any circumstances. Okay, so I tell them, guys, just don't be so nervous. God doesn't have to tell you everything. He doesn't have to answer every question you want to know. He just answers the ones you need to know.
It's a little bit like how we look at the Gospels. They don't all agree. Some people find that as a problem. But you're listening. I heard it once said you're listening in on a conversation between these four evangelists.
Right.
And so, if you took four people to a football game and asked them to describe what they saw, they're all going to see the same football game. They're all going to tell the truth, but are they going to say it the same way?
Exactly. And I would guesstimate, and just a guess on the age of the earth, as young as 10,000, as old as 20,000. Just a guess. I don't believe you can add up the ages, and I'll give you lots of reasons why in my next presentation. But I don't want to go there until I've exhausted questions. Okay. And I think this is very important because I think we can paint ourselves into a corner by insisting the Scripture says more than what it says.
Isn't that Calvinism?
Yes, that's called Calvinism. That is called Calvinism. You know what? I have good Calvinistic friends. They're wonderful Christian people, but sometimes they frustrate me because they have to have an answer in the Bible to all of their questions. And I know the Bible doesn't answer all my questions. It only answers the ones that God thought I needed to know. Does it tell me what Jesus was doing when he was 15 years old? No. If I want to know that, that's great, but it doesn't answer the question. And in that respect, it's no different than any other story of the life of anybody else, right? You read a biography of Dwight Eisenhower. Is it going to tell you what toothpaste he used? Probably not. Maybe you want to know whether he used Crest or something, but it's not going to tell you. The biographer is only going to tell you what he thinks is important for you to know. And the Scriptures are the same way in some respects. They don't tell us everything David did or everything Jesus did or everything Paul did. They tell us what they think it's important for us to know about what David or Jesus or Paul did. So I'll have this on a slide when I get to it. But if you add up the years and you figure I can determine when the flood happened, if you use the Masoretic text, the Septuagint will be a little different, and the Samaritan Pentateuch will be a bit different, but not appreciably so. You'll place the flood right in the middle of the 5th dynasty of ancient Egypt. Now, I defy you to have a flood in the middle of the 5th dynasty of ancient Egypt, and immediately after the flood, a flourishing 5th dynasty of ancient Egypt. It ain't going to happen. Same thing with Mesopotamian chronology, right? You can't do it. You'd be right in the middle of a period that we know about that's well dated in Sumerian chronology. Now, you can argue, well, those chronologies are wrong. Some evangelicals have come to me and said, well, the Bible's right and those chronologies are wrong. My reply is, you're saying your interpretation of the Bible is right and those chronologies are wrong. I'm not saying the Bible is wrong. I'm saying your reading of the Bible is wrong. That's exactly what I'm saying. And, I think it's just obscurantist to say, well, the established chronologies of Egypt or Mesopotamia are wrong without delving into them and trying to show where they're wrong. Just to say, well, we can dismiss those without giving any reason other than your perceived reading of the Bible is just an obscurantist position. That's all that is. Now, I've got a degree in ancient Near Eastern studies from the University of Michigan. That's what my PhD is in. I've seen the evidence for ancient Egyptian chronology. I've seen the evidence for ancient Sumerian chronology. And I defy you to make it fit. Ancient Egyptian chronology, you get back to the 5th dynasty, you can maybe adjust it. There's some assumptions that have to be made. You can maybe adjust it 100 years one way or the other, but it's not going to make a difference. Not a big enough difference to get out of that problem.
How many years back past the 5th dynasty of?
To put the flood,
Yeah.
you'd have to go back. My guess is about 5,000 BC. Just off the top of my head, I'd have to look at all the numbers to be sure. So don't hold me to that. But, we have, for ancient Egypt, we have inscriptional evidence. That's another thing. Evangelicals come back to me, well, you can't use carbon dating to get back that far. I'm not using carbon dating to get back that far. We have inscriptional evidence that goes all the way back to the first pharaoh of a united Egypt on a thing called the Narmer palette. I've seen the Narmer palette. It's in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Okay? We have inscriptional evidence that takes us back there. And then there was pre-dynastic Egypt where you had a northern and a southern, upper and lower Egypt. Lower Egypt in the north, upper Egypt in the south. So you got to take it all the way back before that because you have flourishing Egyptian culture from that point, from pre-dynastic Egypt all the way up to the present day.
Follow up. When does the chronology of the Old Testament actually start?
Abraham,
Thank you. Okay.
as exhibited in my book From Abraham to Paul, A Biblical Chronology. And I'm not challenging that these guys lived as long as the Bible say they lived. If you get the right number, they lived that many years. The other thing we don't know, and I get this question all the time, I'm sure you've gotten it as pastors. How come these people live so many years longer? Even the guys after the flood lived a lot of years longer. How come everybody back then was living so long? I don't know everybody back then was living so long. I only know these 10 guys and these 10 guys. For all I know, they were blessed by God with longer lives, like Moses, who lives 120 years, and in his day, you're lucky to make it to 70. Right? Like Joseph, who lives 100 and, I forget the number now, 36 or something like that. In his day, again, you're lucky to live to 70. Most people die by the time they're 50. For all I know, these people are in the Messianic line and they're blessed by God and they're living longer. I don't know that everybody lived longer back then. That's just an assumption. Most people don't realize they're making an assumption. I don't know everybody wasn't living that long either. I'm agnostic on the issue because I have no data.
You might record the exceptional.
Yeah. These guys might all be exceptions. So, sometimes we internalize these things and we work on assumptions that we haven't even examined. The hardest thing is to examine your own assumptions because you make them so easily and you don't even realize you're making them. I do it. Everybody does it. So, well, anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, off topic though. You mentioned that computers are very helpful, but Oregon and Jerome both did an amazing job, and they didn't have one computer between them.
Right. I agree. But they had all kinds of time on their hands.
Because they didn't have.
Yeah, because they didn't have computers. Because they didn't have the internet. Since we're on the topic, let's interpret the Messianic genealogies of 5 and 11. Genesis 5 genealogy, from Adam to Noah's sons. Adam is the first. Enoch, as is well known, is pointed out to us by Jude, is seventh. And he says he's seventh from Adam. He doesn't say there were only 7. He may just be referring to the genealogy in Genesis when he says he's seventh from Adam, for all we know. Noah is 10th. And it ends with 3 sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, right? Okay, Genesis 11 genealogy, from Shem to Abram and his brothers. Eber, whose name is the source of Hebrew, is the 14th starting from Adam. Okay, Eber is mentioned a good number of times in Genesis. Look at that. You didn't know he was so prominent, did you? Abraham is called the Hebrew, Ha-Ivri, Genesis 14:13. Joseph is called a Hebrew 3 times. This guy's important. He gives his name to these people. Abram is the 20th, double 10, from Adam. Okay, so we have this interesting thing. Important people at positions 7 and double 7, 14, 10 and double 10, 20. What are the reasons to believe that genealogies are not continuous? Well, there's birth information on Shem and Abram. We're going to look at this. I'm just going to give you a preview. This is a preview of where I'm going. We're going to look at the birth information on Shem and Abram, which will tell us something. The use of an H-stem, a hiphiel, verb wayoleth, commonly translated begot or fathered, but the semantics of it may indicate a generation of a descendant or more distant. We'll look at that. We'll do a little Hebrew review about what hiphiel's all about to help you with that. Okay, the positioning of Enoch, Noah, Eber, and Abram in the numerically significant positions in the combined genealogies. 7 and 10, the 2 most important numbers in the Pentateuch. Not just 7 days of creation, not just God's going to punish somebody if they kill Cain, with 7 times. 7's all over the place. Passover lamb, and 10 too. Passover lamb is put aside on the 10th day of the month and sacrificed on the 14th day of the month. Things like that, all over the place. Why not 6th day and 13th day, Then we have the established ancient Near Eastern chronology. I've already talked about a little bit, Egyptian and Mesopotamian. And then the question of who was alive when Abram was born. We'll look at that. These are the things that lead you to suspect that there has to be generations skipped. Okay. When was Shem born? Let's talk about that. Noah was 500 years old, and he fathered, I'm going to translate this fathered for now, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then Noah was 600 years old when the flood came and water covered the earth, right? So how old were Ham, Shem, and Japheth? Well, you would think they had to be 500 years old if that verb means what it appears to mean in English.
You mean that they were
100 years old, yeah. If that verb, what it appears to mean in English, but it doesn't quite mean that in Hebrew, we'll see. And these are the family records of Shem. Shem lived 100 years and fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. Wait a minute, shouldn't that be 102 if we make that assumption about that verb? Maybe that verb doesn't mean what we think it means. If that's true, Shem was born when Noah was 502 years old. Not Noah. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have typed Noah. I mean, Ham, whatever. You know what I mean. Okay. But it's even worse with the case of Abram. Terah lived 70 years and fathered, again, I'm just going to use that for this verb right now, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay. Terah lived 205 years and died in Haran. The Lord said to Abram, go out from your land, your relatives and your father's house to the land I will show you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he left for Haran. Now, wait a minute. Do the arithmetic. If you do that, Abram was born when Terah was 130 years old, not 70. Terah was dead, then he left. There's something about this verb that's not apparent, especially in English translation. We're so wed to reading this in English, even Bible scholars skip over that verb and what it must mean. I'll give you examples to show you what it has to mean. Okay. This problem has been known since antiquity. I don't think I have it on the next slide. If I do, I apologize for going ahead. Samaritan Pentateuch recognized this problem. You know what they did?
Is this a past perfect?
Pardon?
Is this a past perfect?
No,
So it's not had fathers.
no. What Samaritan Pentateuch did was they just adjusted the numbers to make it work. Septuagint did it another way. They said they took Abram's father, Terah, and they say he lived 205 years in Haran and Canaan. They add and Canaan as if he went along with Abram. They adjust the text to try and make it work out. In antiquity, they knew this was a problem.
Just curious, as an option, we can also work both with the previous slide and this one. Is it a possibility that he lived a certain period of time and then began to have his children? Okay, so 70 years and then and Abram's listed first here because he's sort of most important. But like with Noah and his sons, they could, if he has the three sons from 500 to 502, then it works out.
Yeah, and some people have tried that, but the problem is grammatically impossible, right? It's a compound direct object. I'm going to use fathered for now. He fathered Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Yeah, it says when he was X years old, he fathered Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now, if I say to you, on Saturday in the park, I played baseball, football, and soccer with my children. Does that mean on Saturday I played baseball, but on Sunday I played the other two sports? Compound direct object, what applies to one applies to all.
Right. Well, certainly the fathering applies to all, but like if Terah lived 70 years and then he fathers Abraham and Abraham.
Yeah, but if you can use that 70 years to add up, then that 70 years applies to all three.
So they were triplets?
I don't think they were triplets. I don't think that's what the verb means. I'll give you an example of what.
They're not even in birth order. I mean,
Right.
three of Noah's sons
Right.
all over.
If you want to take that line of argument, you've got to apply it to all three. Grammatically, that's the only way you can do it. On Sunday, I played whatever.
Right. Well, so he was the biological father of those three, but we don't know when he started
Yeah.
having them and at what time, how old he was when all three.
Yeah. And we'll get to what this verb means, because I'll give you examples that'll show you what it really means. And those examples have been around for thousands of years, and a lot of times people have just not been paying attention to them. I know it's confusing and it's hard and shock of the new, but I'll show you. Okay, Hezekiah's descendants, same verb in the Hiphil. some of your descendants who come from you, whom you father, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Same verb, Hiphiel again. 150 years separates Hezekiah and his descendants at the time of the Babylonian captivity. Now, what do we know about Hiphiel verbs normally in Hebrew? They're causative. Cause something to happen. It's not to actually do it, it's to cause something to happen. It's when, if you have a verb in the basic stem, the call stem, you put it in the Hiphiel, it adds this cause idea to it. Okay, so if you have an intransitive verb in the call stem, the basic stem, you're going to add one direct object because cause always takes a direct object. If you have a transitive verb in the call stem, you're going to have two direct objects, one for the cause and one for the basic verb meaning. So what's this? This verb yalad is to bear or beget a child. In the call, it means to bear a child or beget a child. In the Hiphiel, it means to cause someone to beget or bear someone. Now, we know, and you can compile examples of this in the Old Testament, sometimes direct objects are left unstated, especially for Hiphiel, what we call two-place Hiphiel verbs, those that take two direct objects. This is compiled in the grammars. They show you this. What's going on? When Noah was so many years old, he caused the birth of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. What did he do to cause the birth? Not stated. The cause never states what the exact cause is. Now, I'll give you my theory. I'm going to reveal the end of the book before we get there. I believe the cause was God promised him he would be the ancestor of the Messiah, and he took it on faith. And that's what caused. And I think that's what's going on here. So this might have been years, a couple years before he was even married. He got this promise. Who knows? I think what's going on here, because you can cause something to happen, it doesn't happen until the future. You all know this from lining up dominoes and knocking them over, right? Knocking over the first one causes the last one to fall over, but not right away. Charles Guiteau shot President James Garfield and caused his death, but Garfield lingered for 2 months before he died. So sometimes cause is immediate, sometimes it's delayed. Here it's delayed. Hezekiah is going to have descendants who are taking into Babylon 150 years later. He's not going to have 150-year-old kids who are taken into Babylon and made eunuchs. First of all, nobody would make a 150-year-old man a eunuch. There's no point. There's no point. Right?
Well, some of these kids were pretty young.
Yeah. Okay. It's causative. Okay. Deuteronomy 4:25. When you have children, same causative verb, and grandchildren, and have been in the land a long time. Notice the compound direct object. You're going to have both. Clearly, the verb cannot refer to fathering a child because you can't father a grandchild. You can't beget a grandchild, right? You can only cause grandchildren to come about by having children. So there's two examples where the verb is clearly causative, and there's going to be a time delay. Yeah, it's just there. It's been there in the text since Moses wrote Deuteronomy. It's been in the text of Kings since whoever wrote Kings. And don't feel bad. You've had scholars reading this for years, read the Hiphiel and read right over it. But the genealogies, there are some genealogies that use the call verb, and they're definitely father to son. But most genealogies in the Bible use the hiphil verb, which allows them to skip generations. Now, natural English cannot adequately express the mode of action, the causative action of Hebrew used verbs in these passages. We have ways of doing causative things in English, but English, like many Indo-European languages, compared to Semitic languages, is fairly impoverished for causatives. Where you go to Arabic or, any other Semitic language, the causatives are much easier. They just have an easier way of doing it. Okay. This explains why translators may at times use different expressions for the same verbs in different contexts when they have causative verbs, because English sometimes simply can't. Now imagine if you tried to translate this verb accurately in an English translation. All of a sudden that genealogy takes up who knows how many pages, right? Because you have to use 4 or 5 words just to explain that English verb, and even then it might not be clear to an English reader. So the translators, I don't blame the translators for doing what they did and putting in beget or fathered or something like that, because there's only so much you can do going from Hebrew to English. There's only so much you can do. And if you did this every time you ran across a problem from Hebrew to English or Greek to English, and you decided to use multiple words to try to make sense of it, you'd have a Bible that you need a forklift to carry around, right? I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Before we stop, can you apply that causative? I'm not tracking the Terah, Abraham, Abraman. So Terah caused Abraham and his brothers to be.
He caused them all, and my theory is, I can't prove it, that God gave him the Messianic promise and he believed it. And that was the trigger for the cause. Not when he got married, not when they were born.
So God says to Terah, hey, I'm going to send a Messianic promise through you.
Terah receives it, appropriates it, and that's what's being counted. That's my theory. I can't prove it.
And so then he has his 3 sons.
Yeah, sometime after that.
After he was 7.
Yeah. And I think that's why I can skip generations. Somebody believed it, and it doesn't really, we skip over several generations to the next important person. I know this is a lot to digest.
Well, it's not that it's hard. I mean, it's hard to digest, but it's to say that Terah has this, we're going to use Yalad and the Dithil to say that Terah has 3 sons, and Yalad and the Dithil to say that Noah has 3 sons. And a kind of a direct way to say they were all born after they were a certain age. But then to apply it back to the genealogies is to say Yalad and the Dithil, but it's not a direct chain of connection.
Right. Some of those are father to son, clearly. So-and-so named his son such and such.
Yeah.
Probably clearly. But some of them, there's no indication in the text that they're father to son. And so they could be grandfather, they could be great-grandfather, they could be, and you should know this from semantics from Hebrew too, right? Son, bane does not necessarily mean son. It can be grandson, great-grandson. After all, Jesus is called Son of David in the New Testament, right? Okay. So the semantics are there in Hebrew to support all these type of things.
Any extra biblical parallel to this for your theory?
What would you want for an extra biblical?
Well, I'm just wondering if there's any kind of comparative.
There have been studies of genealogies in the ancient Near East,
Sort of what I was thinking was just like a king.
and they show that genealogies tend to skip generations and have a maximum of 10 to 12, which matches pretty good here to Genesis.
So this is a typical thing.
Yeah, so it's not out of their culture either. Yeah. It's again, we bring expectations to genealogies that they didn't necessarily bring. And you have ancients on both sides of this. I showed you they have that evidence. Your people in antiquity are reading it both ways. So I've got more. Sorry to leave you in the middle of this, but we'll get to more later.